In Statesboro, a small college town in Georgia known for its hospitality, an incident occurred that shook the residents. 19-year-old Danielle Davis was found in her room in the student dormitory under circumstances that caused serious concern among law enforcement authorities. The students were disturbed and feared for their safety. The investigators understood the necessity to solve the case quickly. However, the motive for the incident remained unclear. Danielle was a popular, striking personality on campus, a student without obvious enemies. She had been studying at the college for only 3 months, but had already become a well-known figure. For her 18th birthday, she had bought herself a sporty Mercedes with money she had inherited from her grandmother. Friends noticed her ability to have fun, and her loud, shrill, cheerful laughter that attracted people. In the fall of 2009, Danielle began her first-year studies at Ogeechee Technical College. She quickly found many friends and became a frequent guest at student parties. Her charisma attracted both girls and boys, including an inconsistent admirer from Savannah. Despite her active social life, Danielle neglected neither her studies nor her family. She planned to spend the winter holidays caring for her mother Stephanie after heart surgery. It was her mother's health that inspired Danielle to study medicine. However, the young woman had no idea that her friendliness and openness could lead to unexpected consequences that would change her life in unforeseen ways. Tuesday, the 8th of December 2009, promised to be a strenuous day for Danielle and her family. The young woman's mother, Stephanie, was preparing for serious heart surgery and desperately wanted to see her daughter before the procedure. Danielle had a full schedule. She had to take an exam in the morning and then immediately set off for the hospital, which was 3 hours away. Stephanie was very worried and found comfort in the thought that her daughter would soon come to support her. With Stephanie was her mother, Dale. Both women waited impatiently for Danielle's arrival. But when it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon and Stephanie was already supposed to be prepared for surgery, the young woman still had not appeared, and her mobile phone answered no calls. Stephanie called 5 or 6 times, Dale just as often or even more frequently, but Danielle did not answer. Then they understood that something unforeseen must have happened. It was completely atypical for Danielle not to come, because she was always present when her mother had medical procedures. Dale began to fear the worst. She suspected that Danielle might have been in a traffic accident, since she knew that the young woman had gone to bed late to study for the exam and might have fallen asleep at the wheel. Stephanie's last words before she was taken to the operating room were, "Find Danielle. Something is wrong." Dale immediately set about fulfilling her daughter's request. She called the administration of the dormitory where Danielle lived and asked them to check on her and verify that everything was in order, explaining the situation. The administration promised to call back within half an hour. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, investigator Jody Stafford received an urgent call. The dormitory manager had found Danielle in her room under circumstances that caused serious concern and immediately notified emergency services. Stafford rushed to the scene without knowing what awaited him. In his police department, reports about such cases rarely came in. Normally, the emergency service arrived first, and in 99% of cases determined natural causes. Stafford even suspected that the dormitory manager might have been mistaken. However, when the officer arrived at the residential complex, it quickly became clear to him that the situation was much more serious than he had originally assumed. At the scene, Officer Stafford met the deeply shaken building manager and his colleague in front of Danielle's room on the 2nd floor. It was obvious that they had been confronted with something extremely disturbing. The woman could barely hold back her emotions while the man appeared shocked, with an absent facial expression. The manager explained that when Danielle did not answer, he had entered with his master key and after seeing the situation had immediately left the room again. When the officer entered the bedroom, he understood the reason for their condition. The room showed traces of a serious incident in which Danielle had gotten into distress. She lay on the floor next to the bed, partially covered by various objects, which gave the impression of an attempted cover-up. After carefully removing the objects, the officers determined that Danielle's clothing was in disarray and her face showed traces of injuries. At the scene, the investigators discovered something strange that indicated extreme aggression by the perpetrator, due to clear traces of pressure on the neck. The most disturbing discovery was a mechanical pencil that was discovered in a dangerous position and hindered Danielle's normal breathing. The impression arose that someone deliberately tried to cause her serious harm. The investigators faced the questions. How could such a terrible event happen, and who could do such a thing to an innocent student? On the 8th of December 2009, a tragic incident occurred with Danielle Davis in a student apartment at Ogeechee Technical College. The shocking news spread quickly across campus and triggered a wave of concern and fear. A reporter from the newspaper Holly Deal Brock noted that she had not observed such a degree of fear among residents for a long time. The students were frightened and asked many questions about their safety. They feared that a dangerous criminal might be in the area. However, their worry was nothing compared to the deep feelings of Danielle's family, who could not understand who and why would have harmed their daughter. The investigation was transferred to the prosecutor and the experienced investigator Jake Wynn. The situation was complicated by the fact that it was exam week and all students, including potential witnesses, would soon be going home for Christmas. Therefore, it was extremely important to carry out all necessary investigative steps in the shortest possible time. The students who were still at the college organized an improvised vigil in front of Danielle's room. The longer the police worked at the scene, the more people gathered around it. Some prayed, others could not hold back their tears. Unexpectedly for the police, a group of somber students offered a potential clue. Two young men, Gerard Cook and Kurt Height, approached the investigators and reported that they had spent the previous evening with Danielle. This was a key moment, as they were among the last to see her alive. Danielle's friends told that they had visited her the evening before, together with her older school friend, Daryl Priestley. Although they were not close friends, Danielle, far from home, considered Daryl one of her own. They came from the same town, which facilitated their communication compared to new acquaintances. Gerard and Kurt were shaken by the news about what had happened to Danielle and protested their innocence. However, the investigators did not exclude them from the list of potential suspects, despite their voluntary statement. When investigating a serious incident, it is important to find independent confirmation for each witness's statements. Therefore, their words were not accepted as true without additional verification. Gerard and Kurt, hoping to help with the investigation, told the detectives in detail about the events of the previous evening. They came around 6 o'clock in the evening together with Daryl Priestley to Danielle. Gerard had to pick up his car that was parked outside the city, and Danielle agreed to drive them. After about an hour, they returned to Danielle's room, where they decided to spend time watching television and recovering from the exhausting exam week. Danielle, they said, had received the guests joyfully. The boys left around 10:30 and left Danielle in good spirits. Despite the apparent sincerity of Gerard's and Kurt's account, the investigators decided to check their statements more thoroughly. Only Daryl Priestley could confirm their words, but it proved difficult to find him. The detective tried for several hours to contact him, but without success. Meanwhile, the results of the medical examination arrived. They refuted the initial assumptions about the nature of the incident, which brought some relief to society and Danielle's family. The analysis showed that the tragic outcome was caused by a disruption of respiratory function that was brought about by external influence with the application of physical force. This information enabled the investigators to better understand the circumstances of the incident, although it did not diminish its tragedy for Danielle's relatives. A key finding was the discovery of skin cells on the murder weapon, which gave the investigators hope for identifying the perpetrator through DNA analysis. Some details uncovered during the investigation confused the investigators. In particular, they were interested in the question of the purpose of the mechanical pencil that was found in dangerous proximity to Danielle's respiratory tract. Experts determined that this action took place only after Danielle no longer showed signs of life. The detectives wondered whether it was a form of mockery or a kind of calling card of the perpetrator. The investigators considered a wide circle of potential suspects, including the 3 persons already known to them, other acquaintances of Danielle from the campus and beyond. Special attention was given to Shane Ullman, Danielle's inconsistent boyfriend who lived in Savannah, only an hour's drive away. Experience showed that in such cases, close or former partners of the victims are often involved. In the investigations in the Danielle Davis case, the detectives focused on her boyfriend, Shane Ullman. They learned that Danielle often drove to Savannah where they spent time together. Despite Shane's claims of not having seen the girl for several weeks, the investigators decided to thoroughly check this lead. Given the nature of the relationship with Danielle, the officers expected that Shane would do everything to be excluded from the circle of suspects, especially considering the frequency of crimes of passion. After the discovery of Danielle in her room in the student dormitory in Statesboro, Georgia, many versions of what happened emerged. Daphne Jari, assistant district attorney of Ogeechee, suspected that the crime was committed in an emotional outburst. The nature of the injuries suffered by Davis suggested that the incident was of a personal nature and could be connected with someone who knew her. Danielle had met Shane only a few months before the tragedy. She worked as a waitress in Savannah on weekends to earn some money, and that's where they met. An immediate sympathy arose between them, but due to Danielle's studies, they could only see each other on weekends. Shane insisted on his innocence and declared himself ready to help the investigations in every respect. However, the detectives noticed peculiarities in his behavior. During a telephone conversation, the investigator did not hear the expected regret or dismay in Shane's voice, which seemed suspicious. Shane claimed to have been in Savannah at the time of the incident, but the investigators understood that this did not exclude the possibility of his traveling to Statesboro, given the short distance between the cities. Special interest was aroused by Shane's report of a telephone conversation with Danielle on the night of the incident. He stated that Danielle had called him at 22:35, and during their 15 to 20-minute conversation, her friend Abby Norris had come to her. Investigator Jake Wynn, who had the feeling that something was not right in Shane's story, decided to thoroughly check his account. A key figure in the investigations became Abby Norris, who was possibly the last person to have seen Danielle. The search for Abby became a priority for the investigators, as she could be either a potential suspect or an important witness who could shed light on Danielle's last hours. The detectives found out that Abby was a freshman student at a neighboring college. When investigator Wynn spoke with her, the girl seemed confused and irritated by the questioning. Abby claimed not to have come to Danielle on the night of the incident, but to have been preparing for an exam. She said that she and Danielle had not seen each other for several weeks because of the approaching holidays. This created a contradiction. Danielle had told Shane that Abby had come to her, but Abby denied this. The suspicion arose that either Danielle did not want Shane to know who had actually come, or Abby was concealing her visit. To confirm her words, Abby made her phone available to the police. Her story was confirmed by conversations with other people. Furthermore, Abby's physical data, she was very petite, made her involvement in this incident unlikely. The investigators concluded that either Shane was telling an untruth or Danielle had deceived him regarding Abby's visit. Unexpectedly, Darryl Priestley, the third friend with whom the police had not yet spoken, came to the police station. The tall and strong teenager made the impression of a gentle giant who was ready to report about the evening of the incident. Darryl reported that during their visit to Danielle, it was difficult to relax because of the constant calls from Shane. According to his words, Shane called between 10 and 10:30 in the evening. Darryl also mentioned that Danielle did not want to answer, out of fear of Shane's anger if he found out about the presence of the 3 boys in her room. These statements by Darryl deviated greatly from the version of events presented by Shane, which drew the special attention of investigator Wynn. The necessity arose to clarify these contradictions in order to illuminate the circumstances of the evening of the incident. Investigator Wynn decided to check Darryl's alibi, which had previously been confirmed by his friends Gerard and Kurt. Originally, Daryl had said he had left Danielle around 10:30 and had gone to the library to study. However, when he was asked whether someone else could confirm his presence there, the situation became unclear. The detectives mentioned that there was a high-quality video surveillance system in the library with which one could precisely determine his arrival and departure time. When he heard this, Daryl unexpectedly changed his version. He laughed and admitted that he had actually not gone to the library. According to his new statements, he had gone to the building but had noticed that he had forgotten his USB stick with all study materials and therefore had not gone inside. This sudden change of statement greatly alarmed the detectives. They noticed that Daryl seemed to have difficulty remembering the events of the evening, which should not be difficult for recently past events. After the change of version, the police officers asked Daryl whether he was ready to give a DNA sample. He readily agreed. Investigator Wynne also hoped to obtain a DNA sample from Shane, Danielle's boyfriend. Meanwhile, the detectives in Statesboro received a new, seemingly promising lead. A certain Mitch Carson reported that he had important information in the Danielle Davis case. He claimed to have spoken with Danielle a few days before the tragedy, and she had told him about a disturbing incident with a man in Savannah. This information interested the investigators as it could point either to Shane, who lived in Savannah, or to an unknown person who might have followed Danielle from Savannah. The Savannah police immediately contacted the investigators from Statesboro and transmitted this new information. However, when the investigators began the conversation with Mitch, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Instead of calling Danielle by her usual name, he mentioned her full name, Brandy Danielle Davis. This seemed strange. Either he was excessively formal, or he was speaking about a different person. To clarify the situation, the detectives asked Mitch to identify Danielle from a photograph. When he saw the picture, Mitch realized that he had been talking about a completely different Danielle Davis. He explained that he had read about the terrible incident in the newspaper where there were no photos, and had hastily concluded that it concerned his acquaintance named Brenda Danielle, who had some problems. Realizing that this information had nothing to do with their investigation, the officers excluded this false lead and continued their work on the case by returning to the investigation of the main suspects and evidence. The detectives decided to visit Shane, Danielle's boyfriend, unannounced during their stay in Savannah. They hoped he would be willing to have a conversation. Instead of a personal meeting, however, Shane's lawyer provided them with detailed written statements. These described Shane's actions, his whereabouts, and his contacts with Danielle on the day of the tragedy in detail. The investigators carefully checked the records of Danielle's phone calls that were available to them. They confirmed Shane's statements about the events of the evening, including the late call from Danielle. Shane described precisely the time of the call and the subsequent attempts to reach her. Thanks to detailed information about the location of the outgoing calls, the detectives were able to confirm that Shane was indeed in Savannah at the time of the incident. This made it possible to exclude him from the list of suspects. However, Shane continued to insist that someone had appeared at Danielle's door during their phone conversation. According to his words, Danielle said that Abby had come and she would call back later. The investigators already knew that it was not Abby, which raised new questions. Who actually came to Danielle, and why did she not tell Shane the truth? The further investigation of Danielle's phone call log led to an unexpected discovery almost 2 weeks after the tragedy. It turned out that Danielle had dialed Daryl Priestley's number twice after the conversation with Shane. This fact became a significant breakthrough in the investigation. Investigator Wynne immediately went to McDonough, Georgia, where Daryl was spending his vacation. Daryl agreed to an interrogation and entered the room showing almost no emotions. However, his composure faltered when the investigators presented him with the call logs. Under the pressure of the evidence, Daryl admitted that he had returned to Danielle around 11 o'clock in the evening to pick up his allegedly forgotten phone. This explanation revealed who had actually knocked on Danielle's door while she was talking to Shane. According to Daryl, he and Danielle searched for his phone, and she called his number to find the device. These calls explained the short calls that were recorded in the phone records. However, the investigators suspected that Daryl might have deliberately left his phone as a pretext for his return. They assumed that Daryl might have taken a liking to Danielle and had returned with certain intentions. These new details significantly changed the course of the investigation and focused attention on Daryl's role in the events of the evening and his possible motives. The investigators now had to find out what actually happened after Daryl returned to Danielle's room. Under the pressure of the evidence, Daryl began to reveal details of the incident. He claimed everything had started with a playful fight with Danielle. According to his words, she had allegedly accidentally fallen during this, and there had been an accident with an office object that posed a threat to Danielle's airways. Daryl explained that he had panicked when he saw how Danielle was having difficulty breathing. Instead of calling for help, he decided to change the environment in the room. This version clarified the mystery surrounding the office object that, according to expert testimony, was placed there after Danielle showed no more signs of life. The investigators suspected that Daryl might have done this to support his version of an accident. On the 22nd of December 2009, Daryl Priestley was arrested for involvement in the tragedy surrounding Danielle. Aware of the gravity of the evidence against him, he confessed his guilt. On the 10th of January 2010, the court imposed a life sentence. Based on the collected evidence, the police reconstructed the events of that night. It is suspected that Daryl became persistent in his intentions after returning to Danielle's room. When he encountered rejection, he lost control. The investigators believe that he used excessive force, which led to the tragic outcome. The investigators assumed that the manipulation of the office object was an attempt to create a false version of events for future explanations. When he realized the seriousness of the situation, Daryl tried to change the environment in the room by covering Danielle with her belongings. The public felt the verdict was an appropriate punishment for the act. The residents of Statesboro continue to preserve a bright memory of Danielle, a student who was loved and respected by many. Danielle's mother finds comfort in the thought of how many lives her daughter touched. She believes that it was Danielle's destiny to have a positive influence on the lives of her friends. According to her words, Danielle continues to affect many people even after her death, beyond the circle of her family and close friends, leaving traces in the hearts of those who knew her, and even those who learned her story later. 1985, at the beginning of the warm season. Underwood, a small town in Minnesota surrounded by picturesque landscapes. A waterfall, a lake, and endless farmlands. In this quiet corner, far from the urban hustle and bustle, lived Sarah Ann Reardon. Like many of her peers, she loved spending time with friends, having fun and going to school. Sarah was tall and very slim, which is why some classmates teased her and called her Beanpole. But this did not prevent her from remaining cheerful, sociable, and friendly. To outsiders, it seemed as if everything was going perfectly for Sarah. With her smile, she literally brightened other people's lives. Beyond the city limits, however, on a farm 6 kilometers from Underwood, Sarah's life looked completely different. She lived there with her father John, her stepmother Merlin, and 10 step-and-half siblings. The Reardon family lived in a cramped apartment where all family members could barely find space. John and Linda Reardon separated in 1970. After the separation, John took over the care of 5 children. 5 years later, he bound himself to Merlin, who already had 4 children of her own. In the new union of John and Merlin, 2 more small children were added. Sarah's mother did not participate in her upbringing. When Sarah's father started a new family, Sarah had to get used to living together with Merlin's children. The head of the family, John Reardon, was distinguished by his large stature and slenderness. He earned his living repairing equipment. The neighbors described him as a pleasant and open person with whom one could always have a cordial conversation. The man worked a lot and often drove to farms where he repaired tires on tractors and trucks. Sarah was his only biological daughter from his first marriage, and he idolized her. In addition, Sarah closely resembled her mother, John's first wife. Sarah found herself in a difficult situation when she had to take on responsibilities that were unusual for her age. In addition to school, she helped her father in the workshop and did housework on the instructions of Marilyn, her father's new wife. The relationship between Sarah and Marilyn was anything but ideal. It was possibly because Sarah remained her father John's favorite. Marilyn treated Sarah differently than the other children, showed excessive strictness, and constantly burdened her with housework. There were difficulties not only with Marilyn. Sarah often had disagreements with her older stepbrother Jeff. Jeff, who had recently dropped out of school, showed a difficult character and frequently caused Sarah problems. Their relationship was extremely tense. The whole family felt how the atmosphere in the house gradually heated up. In this situation, school became a kind of refuge for Sarah, where she could distract herself from the problems at home. Sarah was distinguished by a sharp mind and academic success. She particularly liked the exact sciences, and she devoted her free time to running and jumping. Sarah stayed enthusiastically after class to train or work on interesting projects. Her deepest wish was to dedicate herself to helping people, possibly as a doctor or educator. The 20th of May, 1985 was warm and clear. It was the last week of the school quarter. There were only 4 more days until the beginning of the long-awaited rest. Sarah made her way to class as usual. She wore yellow sneakers, jeans, and a t-shirt with a teddy bear motif. After class, Sarah and her friend Joe decided to stay longer to work on a household assignment. Then they went to a local store called Undermart that was located near the school. This place was popular with students who often stopped by to buy candy and snacks. In the shop, the friends bought balloons and made plans for the next day. They wanted to fill the balloons with water and organize a cheerful game. After the shopping trip, the friends spent time on the playground behind the school, joking and discussing plans for the next day. Around 5:30, Sarah's friend contacted her sister and asked her to come by. The sister arrived at the school, picked up Joe, and offered Sarah to take her along, but she declined and explained that her father would pick her up. After Joe's departure, Sarah remained alone and waited for her father. For a while, Sarah lingered at the school, but John did not appear. Assuming that her father was detained at work, she decided to go home independently. She had to cover 6 kilometers on a suburban road that led eastward. This inconspicuous route was surrounded by trees and hills. The traffic here was not very lively. Cars only rarely passed by. On that day, some residents of Underwood drove past Sarah. All offered her a ride, but she declined and explained that she was waiting for her father. Besides, she enjoyed taking a walk in the fresh air on this warm spring day. The clock in the Reardon house struck 7 o'clock in the evening. Marilyn looked worriedly at the door. Sarah was still not there. Normally she was back by this time, even if she walked. Suddenly the telephone rang. It was John, who asked if he should buy something. When he heard about Sarah's delay, he came home immediately. Time passed, and Sarah did not appear. The worry grew. Marilyn and the eldest son Jeff decided to go searching, while John stayed home in case of a phone call. They drove through the area and contacted family friends, but without success. This was so unlike Sarah's nature. She always came back punctually after class. When all attempts to find Sarah failed, the family turned to the local sheriff's office. John Reardon reported the disappearance of his daughter, who had not come home at the usual time. He expressed the fear that something might have happened to her. Possibly she had stumbled on the way and needed help. As soon as Sarah's disappearance became known, the local investigators immediately began the search. They asked the relatives to fill out the required documents and spread the information in the surrounding localities. The experienced law enforcement officers knew that in such cases various scenarios must be considered, from a voluntary departure due to family problems to more disturbing possibilities. In such situations, the environment of the missing person is usually checked first. It often turns out that precisely those who were in immediate proximity are involved in the disappearance. The investigators determined that on the day when the girl's trail was lost, her father, John Reardon, drove to a neighboring farm to handle business matters, while her mother, Merlin, spent the whole day at work. An important detail was that the missing person had spent time with her friend Joe after school. Without hesitation, the investigators set off to speak with her. Joe described in detail how they had spent time together and described what her friend had worn on that day. The next day, the entire Underwood school was in uproar due to Sarah's absence. Everyone asked themselves in confusion what could have happened and why she had not appeared. Only a few believed in the version of a voluntary departure. Disturbing thoughts about a possible accident crept into their heads. Soon, the news of Sarah's disappearance spread throughout the entire city. About 30 volunteers, a mounted unit from the sheriff's office and specially trained dogs joined the search. Even a helicopter was used in this operation. The Underwood School cafeteria transformed into a coordination center for the search groups. Help was offered by everyone, from acquaintances and complete strangers. Thousands of flyers with Sarah's portrait were sent to localities throughout the entire country. The city residents distributed these announcements and combed through the surrounding fields. Underwood seemed to have become a large family in which everyone tried to make their contribution to the common cause. The people did not give up hope and believed that they would find Sarah and bring her home safe and sound. John, Sarah's father, did not give up and actively participated in the search for his daughter. He turned to television for help and expressed the family's deep concern. "We are all very worried and want to know what happened." Volunteers united their forces with the investigators and carefully combed through the area around the city. Unfortunately, however, without success. As time progressed, the authorities' concerns grew regarding a happy outcome of the situation. The residents of Underwood tried to help in every conceivable way, but gradually unrest gripped the city. After the incident with Sarah, the streets seemed deserted. Parents made efforts not to leave their children unsupervised and accompanied them everywhere. Unfortunately, such stories were no longer rare in the news at the time of Sarah's disappearance. Although missing persons could often be found, there were sometimes also sad outcomes. In the 80s, the authorities took decisive measures and developed a new strategy for searching for missing persons. One of the innovations was placing photos of the disappeared on milk packaging or soda bottles to attract public attention and increase the chances of their discovery. The story of Sarah Reardon began at a time when society was just starting to use new methods for searching for missing persons. In the year 1984, photos of missing persons appeared on milk packaging for the first time. The first of these images was the portrait of Ethan Patz, whose fate had been unknown for several years already. Everything began on an ordinary Friday, the 25th of May, 1979. Ethan set out alone to school for the first time. His route was supposed to be only 2 blocks to the bus stop at the intersection of West Broadway and Spring Street. On that day, he was dressed entirely in blue: hat, shirt, jeans, and sneakers. But something went wrong, and Ethan did not reach the bus. When he did not return home after school, his worry-stricken mother turned to the police. That same evening, intensive search actions began. About 100 police officers and specially trained dogs set out. The search for Ethan continued for several weeks. Initially, the investigators' attention was directed toward the Patz family, but soon it became clear that the parents had nothing to do with the incident. The entire city united in the attempt to find the missing person. Information posters with Ethan's photo were hung up everywhere, but unfortunately, this did not bring the desired results. Ethan's father, Stan Patz, who worked as a photographer, used his professional skills to help with the search. He distributed numerous photos of his son, which appeared not only on posters and milk packaging, but were even visible on the large screens at Times Square. This incident became the impetus for founding a movement that aimed to help in similar situations. It led to the introduction of new laws and methods for searching for missing persons. Ethan Patz was the first whose image appeared on a milk package to awaken public attention. In the year 1983, President Ronald Reagan declared the 25th of May a special day of remembrance. This date was chosen in honor of young Patz, whose fate remained unknown. On this day, people remember those who are missing, as well as those who were found. Shortly thereafter, photos of missing persons began to be placed on milk packaging nationwide. Let us return to Sarah's story. The residents of Underwood believed that such sad events only occurred in noisy metropolises, but not in their quiet, rural area. But Sarah's case changed their perspective. The local authorities decided to follow the example with the milk packages. They began attaching Sarah's photo to 2-liter bottles of Pepsi that were sold in Minnesota and the adjacent states. These images served as a constant reminder that the search for Sarah was still continuing. Every day, many reports came in to the police station. People called with different information. Some had noticed something, others had heard something, and some simply shared their assumptions. The investigators made careful efforts to separate useful clues from empty rumors. They checked every tip, but all attempts remained fruitless. 2 days after Sarah had disappeared, one of the residents reported something interesting. He was driving on the same road and noticed a young woman walking along the roadside. According to his words, after he had driven past her, he saw a green Chevrolet in front of him. The car was moving slowly, as if it wanted to turn toward the farm. But when the neighbor continued driving, he noticed that the vehicle changed direction and drove toward the young woman. That was exactly the clue the investigators had been waiting for. They decided to track down the driver of the Chevrolet at any cost. The investigation of Sarah Renan's mysterious disappearance continued. The investigators created extensive lists of license plates of green vehicles that resembled the described model. There were hundreds throughout the state. Parallel to this laborious work, various assumptions from residents came in. Some put forward the theory that Sarah might have been taken by her estranged mother. However, this assumption found no confirmation. More unusual reports also came in. Someone claimed to have seen the young woman in Texas, others in a roadside cafe in Iowa. There were even reports about her suspected whereabouts in Montana. The investigators carefully examined every piece of information that came in, however, without success. Meanwhile, the city residents continued to wait anxiously for news. 7 long weeks had already passed since Sarah had disappeared without a trace. On the 6th of July, 1985, an unexpected turn occurred. A farmer from a neighboring town, which was about a half-hour's drive from Underwood, became aware of the strange behavior of his cows. For some reason, the animals avoided a certain area of the pasture where tall grass and thistles had grown. One day, a resident decided to explore an abandoned property nearby. Near this place flowed a wide drainage ditch. As he approached the dense grass, he perceived a strange scent. When he looked into the ditch, the man made a disturbing discovery. There lay something, clothed in a pink t-shirt on which 2 teddy bears were depicted. It turned out that it was the missing Sarah Reardon. The news of the discovery on the abandoned property shook the entire area. The long search for Sarah Reardon ended in the saddest way. People could not hold back their feelings and demanded answers about the incident. Many efforts and time were expended for the search. The investigators conducted a thorough examination. On the head, they noticed traces of impact from an object. Sarah's t-shirt showed a small round damage. This matched the markings on the skin of the abdomen. Everything indicated that something terrible had happened to Sarah, and her demise was not natural. The residents of Underwood gathered to pay their last respects to Sarah. The gymnasium of the local school could barely contain the crowd of those present. The atmosphere was filled with grief. The city residents could hardly accept the sad circumstances under which the young woman's life ended. Classmates left moving messages and remembered Sarah's cheerful character. The family was in deep shock. At the farewell ceremony, Sarah's father, John Reardon said with undisguised emotion, "I cannot believe that someone could do such a thing. The guilty party must be held accountable for his actions." Sarah was buried in the cemetery of the Lutheran Church north of Underwood. After the farewell to the young woman, the local community united in the effort to find the one who was responsible for this tragic incident. The investigators were completely absorbed in this case. They devoted nearly their entire time to it and worked many hours daily. The main task was to locate a green vehicle of a specific brand that, according to an eyewitness's statement, had moved in Sarah's direction on that fateful day. This witness had previously approached the law enforcement authorities and reported the car he had noticed on the street where Sarah was returning home. After lengthy investigations, the investigators managed to pick up the trail of the owner of this vehicle. Without losing time, they conducted a conversation with the driver to find out details of his route. To their amazement, the man not only remembered that trip, but also confirmed that he had indeed turned around near the yard. However, when the investigators tried to match his account with the available information, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. Sarah's story began on the 20th of May, a Monday. Initially, a Chevrolet driver attracted attention, but soon it turned out that he had traveled the street in question a day earlier, on the 19th of May, a Sunday. The law enforcement authorities could confirm his statements, and this seemingly promising clue led to no progress in the investigation. August 1985 arrived. A month had passed since Sarah was found in a condition that caused deep shock among all involved, but the investigations continued to mark time. During this time, John Reardon endeavored to draw society's attention to the problem of missing minors. He became the voice of all parents affected by similar misfortune. The man actively communicated with the media and worked with the Attorney General of Minnesota. He participated in founding an organization for families who had lost their children and wanted to lead the search operations. But time marched on relentlessly, and with each day, the investigators' hope of solving Sarah's mysterious case dwindled. The investigators found themselves in a dead end after exhausting all possible theories. But then there was an unexpected turn in the case. Shortly before Sarah's disappearance, her notebook was found at school, which was only now thoroughly examined. The content of the records shocked everyone. It became clear that Sarah suffered strong mental anguish. She wrote about her fears and pleaded with an unknown person not to cause her any more harm. These notes, as well as Sarah's frequent presence at school after classes, indicated a difficult situation at home. Disturbed by the new information, the law enforcement authorities decided to examine the situation in Sarah's home more closely. Attention quickly turned to a relative who showed no particular urgency in searching for Sarah. This was her stepbrother, Jeff. It was known that Sarah did not have a good relationship with the new family members, especially not with Jeff. As the older one, he behaved unfriendly towards Sarah. Possibly it was precisely because of this person that dark undertones appeared in Sarah's diary. It cannot be ruled out that the stepbrother could harbor evil intentions. There was the possibility that Jeff had encountered Sarah on her way home and something irreversible had happened. When Jeff was invited for a conversation, he remained silent at first. Under pressure from the investigators, however, he revealed a disturbing family secret. It turned out that Jeff had tried to persuade Sarah to inappropriate actions some years ago. This information deeply shocked the investigators. They inquired whether Jeff was involved in Sarah's disappearance, but he insisted on his innocence. The investigators, for their part, understood that Jeff was physically not capable of carrying out what was planned and, what is no less important, hiding traces at a distance of 50 kilometers from home. He possessed neither a driver's license nor access to a vehicle. Furthermore, Merlin and other family members confirmed that Jeff was at home on the evening of Sarah's disappearance. The law enforcement officers decided to check once more what the family members had been occupied with on the day of the incident. At the beginning of the investigation, they had already questioned Sarah's relatives about their whereabouts on the evening of the 20th of May. At that time, it seemed as if everyone had confirmation for their statements. For safety's sake, however, it was decided to speak again with Sarah's siblings. And precisely then, the case took an unexpected turn. During the renewed conversation with Sarah's stepsisters about the events of the 20th of May, the investigators learned of another, even more disturbing family situation. One of the sisters shared information about her stepfather John's inappropriate behavior towards Sarah. The investigators were shocked. No one had expected such a development. Without losing time, they decided to speak with John immediately. They contacted him without mentioning the conversation with the sisters and arranged a meeting at his home after his workday. When John Reardon returned home, the investigators immediately began asking him uncomfortable questions about his relationship with his daughter Sarah. Initially, John denied everything, but gradually he began to admit some facts. First, he spoke of a single incident, but toward the end of the conversation he already mentioned 10 or 20 episodes. It turned out that John Reardon had abused his position in the family. The man who had helped the law enforcement authorities all summer now found himself at the center of the investigation. In the course of the conversation with the investigators, John admitted to pressuring Sarah into inappropriate actions, but insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He constantly repeated, "You must find the one who harmed my daughter." The investigators understood that it would be difficult to prove John's guilt without his complete confession. They found themselves confronted with a situation in which a person partially admits their unlawful actions, but denies any involvement in a more serious incident. Initially, it seemed as if John had an unassailable alibi. The investigators found out that on the day Sarah stopped reporting in, John was on a farm in the neighboring town repairing agricultural machinery. At first glance, he could not physically be in Underwood at the right time. However, when new facts emerged in Sarah's story, the law enforcement authorities decided to speak once more with the farmer who had confirmed John's whereabouts. They asked to show the exact location where Reardon had worked that day. Surprisingly, it turned out that the farm was only 6 kilometers away from the place where Sarah was last seen. This discovery gave cause for thought. It was quite possible that John would have had enough time to briefly leave the field and be on that very street where Sarah was walking. After receiving additional information, the investigators invited John Reardon for another conversation. They asked him again whether he was connected to the incident that had befallen Sarah. Surprisingly, John answered in quite an unusual way. He said, "I want to gain clarity in the matter myself. I must find out what actually happened." He admitted the possibility of his involvement, but claimed he could not remember the events. Psychological specialists suspected that John might suffer from a special condition in which a person loses personal memories due to severe stress or a shattering experience. The ability to absorb new information remains intact. To help John reconstruct the events, he was suggested to take a special substance that reduces concentration and makes it difficult to distort facts. Additionally, they did not let him rest and kept him awake with caffeinated drinks. Behavioral experts tried to decipher John's answers during the conversation. To the regret of everyone present, he merely repeated his confession of inappropriate behavior. The investigators were stuck in a dead end. Unexpectedly, a representative of the federal authorities who was observing the process asked John a question about Sarah's last words. John Reardon answered, "I love you, Papa." With that, the conversation ended. After the discussion, Reardon asked the investigators to check the toolbox in his car. It contained an object to which traces might possibly adhere. It turned out that Reardon had met Sarah on her way home. They drove several kilometers to an abandoned building. On that day, Sarah informed her father that she did not want to continue the previous relationship. She was growing up and longed for a normal life. Her rejections evoked negative reactions in her father. This led to tragic consequences for Sarah. On that evening, when the other family members were sitting at dinner and watching television, Sarah found herself in a terrible situation for which John, her own parent, was responsible. After the incident, John returned home as if nothing had happened. At this point, Marilyn was already beginning to worry about Sarah's absence. She set out to search together with Jeff, while John promised to stay home by the phone. Instead, however, he returned to where he had left Sarah. He wrapped her in a carpet and left her in a roadside ditch. After some time, the investigators finally learned the truth about the events of that fateful day on the 20th of May, 1985. Shortly after John Reardon's confession, this information spread throughout the entire city. The residents were shocked and outraged. They felt deceived. Since Sarah's disappearance, John had frequently been seen in newspapers and on television. In his appearances, he asked for help in searching for his daughter. It turned out that he had shamelessly misled everyone the entire time. The story of the Reardon family took an unexpected turn when Marilyn decided to end the marriage with John, despite earlier promises of support. In the spring of 1986, the court imposed a harsh sentence against John Reardon in connection with the Sarah case. By an amazing coincidence, his former wife Marilyn married another man on the same day. Some months later, in the summer of the same year, Marilyn Nagel, John's former wife, confessed her involvement in the unfavorable situation surrounding Sarah. She claimed to have had suspicions regarding Reardon's inappropriate behavior towards Sarah, but to have possessed no direct evidence of it. The court sentenced Nagel to a probationary sentence and required her to seek counseling. John Reardon, who is now over 60 years old, continues to serve his sentence in a correctional facility in Minnesota. In the mid-90s, he made an attempt to challenge the verdict with the help of a woman he had met and married in prison. Her name was Bettila Odar, but she was often called Bible Betty due to her work as a prison evangelist. Reardon's and Odar's marriage lasted until 2004. According to the obituary, Bettila died in the year 2011. The fate of Sarah Ann Reardon left deep traces in the hearts of the residents of Underwood. After the court proceedings in the year 1986, the locals tried to put this dark chapter in the history of their small town behind them. But 5 years later, John unexpectedly appeared on television. In the show Open Confession, the host asked him a question about his daughter. John's answer shocked with its callousness. "Honestly, I don't think about Sarah often. You can't change the past, after all." The tragic events surrounding Sarah initially deeply shook the residents of Underwood, but then paradoxically brought them together. Even today, years later, her classmates remember her radiant smile and infectious laughter with fondness. Although they have long since had families of their own, Sarah's image lives on in their memory as a symbol of steadfastness and determination. They remember her as a young woman who found the strength to resist the wrong actions of a close person, despite her young age.